September 1944. Outside a tactical headquarters in France, rain pounded relentlessly against the canvas and metal of the command caravans. Yet inside, the storm was far more volatile. Two men faced off in a confrontation that threatened to rip the Allied command structure apart at its seams. At one side of the map table stood Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the legendary victor of El Alamein, a tactical mastermind with an ego to match, a man who demanded absolute, unquestioned obedience from his subordinates. Across from him stood General Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army. He was stiff, formal, and seemingly overshadowed by the British icon. Yet Crerar carried a weapon Montgomery could not comprehend: the authority of a sovereign nation that had bled too much to simply obey orders as if it were a colonial dependency. Montgomery had reached his limit. Furious at what he perceived as defiance, he aimed to crush the Canadian general. Locking eyes with Crerar, he delivered the ultimate military threat, a polite British phrase imbued with the weight of career-ending judgment. In the rigid hierarchy of the British military, it was a death sentence. It meant dismissal. It meant disgrace. But Crerar did not flinch. He knew he answered to two masters, the Field Marshal before him and the government across the Atlantic. He understood that dismissing the commander of a national army was not merely a tactical decision, it was a political crisis poised to explode. With cool calculation, he played his ace. This is the true account of the moment Canada finally asserted itself. To understand why a Canadian general would risk his career and the stability of the Allied command over a scheduling conflict, one must first grasp the geography of Canadian grief. To comprehend the defiance in that tent, one must travel back to the pebble beaches of Dieppe. By September 1944, the Allied forces were sweeping across France with unstoppable momentum. But for the soldiers of the 2nd Canadian Division, the advance toward the French coast was more than a military maneuver, it was a pilgrimage. They were returning to the site of a national trauma. 2 years earlier, on August 19, 1942, this same division had assaulted the fortified seawalls of the resort town in Operation Jubilee. It was a trial of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and the result had been a disaster that left deep scars on the Canadian psyche. In a single morning, over 900 Canadians were killed, and nearly 2,000 captured. Regiments from tightly knit communities across the Dominion were decimated in mere hours. For 2 years, telegrams had arrived in homes from Toronto to Winnipeg, bearing the grim news of sons lost on Blue Beach and Red Beach. Dieppe became a word whispered with a mixture of pride and horror, a living wound, a debt of blood that the Canadian Army felt compelled to repay. When the 2nd Division returned in 1944, the Germans had mostly withdrawn, denying them the vengeance of battle but offering something perhaps more profound, a chance for closure. The liberation of Dieppe was swift, but the atmosphere remained heavy with ghosts. Soldiers marching into town walked in the footsteps of their fallen brothers, visiting the graves of men they had trained with, friends left behind on the wire. The commander of the 2nd Division organized a solemn commemoration to mark this return. It was to be a march past and a memorial service on Sunday, September 3rd. This was not merely ceremonial, it was a national act of remembrance. It sent a message to families back home that their sacrifice had not been forgotten, that the army had returned to honor its own. For General Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army, attending this event was not a social call, it was a summons from history. Crerar was acutely aware of his unique responsibility. He was not just a corps commander within the British system, he was the highest-ranking Canadian officer in the field. He carried the weight of his government's expectations and the scrutiny of a public wary of seeing its soldiers treated as shock troops for British objectives. He understood that the Canadian Army embodied national sovereignty. To stand at Dieppe, to take the salute, and to honor the dead of 1942 was the supreme duty of his command. It was a moral and political imperative that transcended strategy. Yet Field Marshal Montgomery operated in a different reality. For Monty, the war was a matter of logistics, momentum, and command. The past was irrelevant, only the next objective mattered. He was consumed with the drive into Belgium and across the Rhine. To him, an army commander's duty was to remain at headquarters, planning the destruction of the enemy, not attending ceremonial events in recently liberated towns. By fate, Montgomery scheduled a critical meeting of his army commanders for the exact same time as the Dieppe Memorial, September 3. It was a collision of two worlds. On one side was the ruthless efficiency of the British High Command, personified by Montgomery, who viewed Dominion forces as subordinate units to be directed at will. On the other side was the rising nationalism of Canada, embodied by Crerar, who saw his army as an independent force, allied but not subservient. Crerar received the order to attend the meeting. He studied the calendar. He traced the map of Dieppe. He knew that if he failed to appear at the cemetery, if he prioritized a staff meeting over the graves of men who had died in 1942, he would fail in his duty as a national leader. He would confirm the fears of the Canadian public that their army remained a colonial appendage of the British War Office. He made his choice. With the precision of a man who understood the rules yet was willing to break them, he informed Montgomery's chief of staff that he would not attend the tactical conference. He explained that he had a prior engagement at Dieppe, a ceremonial obligation he considered paramount, and would instead send his own chief of staff to take notes. To Montgomery, this was inconceivable. In his eyes, a general did not refuse a summon from a field marshal. He saw it as a direct affront to authority, a petty display of independence at a time when Allied unity was supposedly essential. He did not see the ghosts. He did not hear the silence of the Dieppe cemetery. He only saw a subordinate officer disobeying a direct order. The stage was set. Crerar went to Dieppe. He stood in the solemn silence of the memorial, surrounded by the living and the dead of the 2nd Division. He fulfilled his duty to his nation. But as the last notes of the bugle faded over the French coast, a different storm was brewing back at the tactical headquarters. Montgomery was waiting, and his patience had run out. The ghosts of Dieppe had been honored, but the price would be a confrontation that threatened to end Harry Crerar's career. On the morning of September 3, 1944, the war in Europe existed in two separate irreconcilable dimensions. Geographically, only a few hours of travel separated the white cliffs of Dieppe from Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters in the Belgian borderlands. But philosophically, the distance between them was unbridgeable. It was in this gap that the conflict between Harry Crerar and Bernard Montgomery transformed from a clash of personalities into a crisis of sovereignty. In Dieppe, the atmosphere was thick with the heavy solemnity of a cathedral. General Crerar stood on the podium, his posture rigid, his face unreadable behind his mustache. Before him marched the survivors and replacements of the 2nd Canadian Division. The march past was more than a display of military discipline. It was a ritual of exorcism. For 2 years, the Canadian Army had lived in the shadow of the 1942 disaster. Every strategic decision, every casualty report had been viewed through the lens of that failure. Now standing on the liberated ground where their comrades had fallen, the Army was reclaiming its honor. For Crerar, this moment was the culmination of his duty as a national commander. This was a title that Montgomery recognized on paper but frequently ignored in practice. To Crerar, the 1st Canadian Army was an instrument of the Canadian government. Its morale, its reputation, and its political standing were his primary responsibilities. He knew that the eyes of Prime Minister Mackenzie King and the Canadian public were fixed on this ceremony. To be absent would have been a dereliction of his duty to the state. In his mind, the war effort was not served solely by bullets and fuel. It was served by the will of the people supporting it. By honoring the dead of Dieppe, he was sustaining the national will to fight. Meanwhile, at the 21st Army Group headquarters, the reality was starkly different. Field Marshal Montgomery inhabited a world of maps, supply lines, and ruthless forward momentum. He was orchestrating a massive complex machine designed to crush the German resistance in the Low Countries. His focus was entirely on the future, on the Scheldt. estuary, on the Rhine, and on the ultimate drive into the heart of Germany. To Montgomery, the concept of a national army within his command was a bureaucratic nuisance. He viewed the Allied forces as a singular entity under his supreme direction. He expected his army commanders to be extensions of his own will, available instantly, obedient completely, and focused exclusively on the tactical problems at hand. When he summoned his commanders for a conference on September 3, he did not view it as an invitation. It was a mobilization of his inner circle to dictate the next phase of the campaign. When Crerar's message arrived at headquarters stating that he would not attend the conference due to the ceremonial commitment at DEP, the reaction was volcanic. Crerar had followed proper military protocol by dispatching his chief of staff, Brigadier C.C. Mann, to represent him. In a standard military context, this was an acceptable substitution. Commanders in the field often delegated attendance when operational or other duties interfered. However, Montgomery did not view this through the lens of standard protocol. He viewed it through the lens of his own ego and his prejudices against the colonial command. He saw Brigadier Mann walking into the tent not as a capable representative, but as a living symbol of Crerar's defiance. To Monty, Crerar's absence was a personal slight. It confirmed his long-held suspicion that the Canadian general was more interested in the pomp and circumstance of being a general than in the gritty, difficult work of winning the war. The clash of priorities was absolute. Crerar prioritized the spiritual and political health of his army, believing that a force disconnected from its nation's history would lose its fighting spirit. Montgomery prioritized the operational efficiency of the army group, believing that any distraction from the tactical objective was a waste of time and resources. As the meeting progressed, Montgomery's irritation hardened into a dangerous resolve. He looked around the room and saw compliance from his British subordinates, but from the Canadian sector, he saw independence. He interpreted Crerar's choice as a lack of professional seriousness. He believed that Crerar was parading while other men were dying. This misinterpretation was fatal to their relationship. Montgomery failed to understand that for a Canadian, the parade at DEP was part of the fighting. It was the reason they were fighting. By the time Brigadier Mann left the meeting to report back to Crerar, the damage was done. Montgomery had decided that the dual command structure where Crerar answered to both him and Ottawa was no longer sustainable. He wanted a commander who was a soldier first and a Canadian second. Since Crerar had proven he was a Canadian first, Montgomery decided he had to go. The tactical meeting ended, but the real battle was just beginning. The priority of the battlefield had collided with the priority of the nation, and neither man was willing to yield the right of way. The meeting that followed the DEP controversy was not intended to be a debate. It was intended to be an execution. When General Harry Crerar arrived at Field Marshal Montgomery's tactical headquarters, the air was charged with a cold administrative violence. The rain that had battered the encampment the previous night had settled into a damp chill, mirroring the reception that awaited the Canadian commander. Crerar was ushered into Montgomery's caravan, a small, cramped space that served as the nerve center of the 21st Army Group. It was here, surrounded by maps of Europe and the smell of stale tobacco, that Montgomery planned to dismantle the leadership of the 1st Canadian Army. Montgomery sat behind his desk, the portrait of a man whose patience had been entirely exhausted. To him, the war was a mathematical equation of force, time, and will. Any variable that did not function according to his calculations had to be removed. In his estimation, Harry Crerar had become a defective variable. The missed conference on September 3 was merely the catalyst, the spark that ignited a reservoir of frustration that had been filling since the Normandy campaign.
Montgomery had long harbored doubts about Crear's battlefield instincts,
viewing him as too cautious, too slow, and far too concerned with the political optics of Ottawa rather than the tactical realities of the Scheldt. The conversation began with Montgomery's characteristic bluntness. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His authority was absolute, forged in the deserts of North Africa and cemented by the victories in France. He listed his grievances with the precision of a prosecutor. He criticized the operational pace of the Canadian forces. He questioned Crear's grip on the battle. But the core of his attack returned to the events of the previous day. He dismissed Crear's attendance at the DEP memorial as a sentimental error, a misallocation of a commander's time during a critical phase of the war. In Montgomery's worldview, the dead were to be honored by winning the war quickly, not by standing in cemeteries while the enemy regrouped. Crerar stood his ground, listening to the Huron with the stoic discipline that defined his career. He was a man of immense self-control, a trait often mistaken for lack of imagination. As Montgomery spoke, Crerar understood that this was not a counseling session. It was not a reprimand designed to improve performance. It was a prelude to dismissal. Montgomery was not looking for an apology. He was building a case for removal. Then came the sentence that was designed to end it all. Montgomery looked at the Canadian general, his eyes hard and unblinking, and delivered the line that had ended the careers of British generals before him. "Harry," he said, "I've had enough. Our ways must part." In the lexicon of the British High Command, this phrase was a guillotine. It was a polite, euphemistic way of saying, "You are fired." It meant that confidence had been lost, that the subordinate was to be relieved of command and sent home. For a professional soldier, it was the ultimate disgrace. To be sent back to Canada in the middle of the war, labeled as the general who couldn't keep up with Montgomery, would be a humiliation that would stain Crerar's legacy forever. It would signal to the world that Canadian leadership was not up to the task, that when the stakes were highest, the Dominion still needed a British hand on the tiller. Montgomery fully expected Crerar to crumble. He was accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of the British military where a field marshal's word was law. In that system, when a superior officer decided that ways must part, the subordinate packed his bags and faded into obscurity. Montgomery assumed that the same rules applied to the Canadians. He viewed the 1st Canadian Army essentially as a corps of the British Army, subject to the same discipline and the same disposal procedures. He believed he held the power of professional life and death over the man standing before him. But as the words hung in the silence of the caravan, Montgomery failed to realize a crucial geopolitical reality. He was treating a diplomatic crisis as a personnel issue. He saw Crerar as an employee. Crerar saw himself as an ambassador. The threat, "Our ways must part," was based on the assumption that Montgomery had the unilateral authority to sever the relationship. He was operating on the memory of an empire, where the colonies did as they were told. Crerar did not flinch. He did not beg for a second chance. He did not offer excuses about the difficulties of the terrain or the fatigue of his troops. Instead, he absorbed the threat, processing the gravity of Montgomery's intent. He realized that this was no longer about strategy or tactics. It was a test of national will. Montgomery had played his highest card, the threat of dismissal. Now, it was time for Crerar to reveal that he was playing a different game entirely. The silence in the caravan stretched thin, the tension reaching its breaking point as Crerar prepared to deliver the response that would redefine the relationship between the two armies.
The silence that followed Montgomery's ultimatum was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of a trap, snapping shut. In that cramped caravan, amidst the maps and the damp air of the front, Field Marshal Montgomery believed he had just played the final move in a game of military discipline. He had asserted his authority as the supreme commander of the theater, expecting the Canadian general to fold, to salute, and to accept his fate as a casualty of the command structure. But Montgomery had made a critical error in judgment. He had forgotten that Harry Crerar was not merely a soldier in the British Army. He was the embodiment of a sovereign nation's will. Crerar looked at the man who had just threatened to destroy his career. He did not see a superior officer to whom he owed blind allegiance. He saw a British commander who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the alliance. Crerar knew the regulations better than anyone. He knew the Visiting Forces Act and the complex legal agreements that governed the presence of Canadian troops in Europe. These documents were not just bureaucratic red tape. They were the shield of Canadian independence. They stipulated that while a Canadian commander fell under British operational control for the fighting of battles, the ultimate authority regarding the employment and dismissal of that commander rested solely with the Government of Canada. Crerar understood the architecture of power in a way Monty did not. He answered to two masters. One was the tactical commander in the field, but the other and the far more powerful one was the War Committee of the Canadian Cabinet in Ottawa. Crerar was their man. He was their guarantee that Canadian sons would not be wasted, that Canadian interests would be respected, and that the Dominion would stand as an equal partner in the crusade against fascism. With the calm demeanor of a poker player holding a royal flush, Crerar delivered his counter-strike. He did not shout. He did not plead. He simply stated a procedural fact that carried the force of a high-explosive shell. Go ahead. Try it, he said, his voice level and cold. I'll consult Ottawa first. In those 8 words, the power dynamic in the room shifted violently. To the uninitiated, it might have sounded like a bureaucratic delay. To Montgomery, it was a nuclear threat. The mention of Ottawa brought the entire weight of the Canadian government into the tactical tent. It summoned the specter of Prime Minister Mackenzie King, a politician known for his obsessive defense of Canadian autonomy and his prickly relationship with the British aristocracy. Crerar was effectively telling Montgomery, "You can attempt to dismiss me," Crerar said, "but if you do, I will pick up that telephone and call my Prime Minister. I will inform him that the British Field Marshal is removing the commander of the Canadian Army for choosing to honor the fallen of DEP rather than attend a staff conference." The implications of such a move were catastrophic. If Crerar involved Ottawa, the issue would instantly escalate from a personnel dispute to a full-blown international diplomatic crisis. The story would leak to newspapers, and the headlines in Toronto and Montreal would roar that the British were once again showing contempt for Canadians, disregarding the heroes of DEP to satisfy the vanity of a field marshal. It would threaten the cohesion of the Commonwealth alliance at the very moment the Allies were advancing into Germany, hand a propaganda victory to the enemy, and ignite a political storm in London and Ottawa that even Winston Churchill would struggle to contain. Montgomery, for all his arrogance, was a man of sharp intellect. He recognized immediately that he had walked into a minefield. He could dismiss a British Corps commander before breakfast without a second thought. He could reorganize entire British divisions with a gesture, but he could not touch Harry Crerar without triggering a political explosion capable of devastating repercussions. He understood that Crerar was not bluffing. The Canadian general was fully prepared to ignite a crisis to protect the integrity of his command. This was the Ottawa card, the ultimate check on British authority. It symbolized the end of the era when the Empire could dictate terms to its colonies. The Canadian Army was not a temporary auxiliary, it was an equal partner.
By invoking Ottawa, Crerar was drawing an inviolable line. His authority derived from the Canadian people and could only be revoked by their elected representatives. The weight of the threat filled the room, undeniable and immutable.
Montgomery stared at Crerar, grasping the new reality. The gulf between them could not be bridged because the cost of confrontation was too high.
The Field Marshal had to accept that his absolute command ended where Canadian sovereignty began. The bluff had been called, the threat neutralized, and the balance of power permanently altered.
Crerar had won.
The confrontation in the tactical caravan had reached an irreversible point. The threat had been issued, the counter-threat delivered, and the command structure of the 21st Army Group now hung in a delicate balance.
For Montgomery, this was unfamiliar territory.
He was a man accustomed to the black and white logic of the battlefield, victory or defeat, command or obedience. He had spent his career breaking the will of enemies and bending his subordinates to his will. But facing Crerar, he encountered someone whose resolve could not be shattered by military discipline alone.
The words, "I will consult Ottawa first," resonated through the small room like a seismic shock.
In that instant, the dispute transformed. It was no longer a clash between superior and subordinate over a missed meeting. It had become a constitutional standoff.
Montgomery, for all his abrasive arrogance, possessed a keen political instinct when his own survival was at stake. He quickly calculated the trajectory of Crerar's threat. If Crerar called Prime Minister Mackenzie King, King would call Winston Churchill. The British War Cabinet, already navigating a fragile web of alliances, would be forced to choose between supporting their brilliant but temperamental Field Marshal or alienating their most important Dominion ally. Montgomery knew the numbers. Canada was no minor player.
By late 1944, the 1st Canadian Army was a massive and essential component of the Allied advance, holding a crucial sector of the front. To provoke a diplomatic rupture over personal pride would be a strategic disaster of the highest order and provide ammunition to Montgomery's detractors in London and Washington, already exasperated by his ego. He realized that while he could move divisions on a map, he lacked the political capital to humiliate a sovereign nation. The giant blinked. The retreat was neither immediate nor graceful. Montgomery was not given to apologies, but the shift in his demeanor was evident. The fury that had filled the room dissipated, replaced by a grudging pragmatic acceptance.
He realized he could not remove Harry Crerar.
The Canadian general had drawn a circle of sovereignty around himself that the British Field Marshal could not breach. The conversation shifted. The threat of dismissal was quietly shelved, left unresolved but acknowledged. They returned to the business of war, discussing logistics, armor, and infantry movements. Yet the dynamic had changed fundamentally. The hierarchy had flattened. Crerar was no longer a mere subordinate of the army group leader, he was a partner who had successfully asserted his authority. This represented a major victory for Canadian autonomy. For decades, the Canadian military had struggled to emerge from Britain's shadow. In World War I, Canadian troops fought with distinction but often as shock troops under British discretion. The struggle for an independent voice had been arduous. By standing firm in that tent, by daring to challenge the most powerful British soldier of the war, Crerar had secured the independence that thousands of Canadian soldiers had sacrificed to achieve.
The crisis passed, but relations remained cool. Montgomery would never warm to Crerar, privately regarding him as obstinate and uninspired. Crerar continued to view Montgomery as brilliant but insufferably egotistical. Yet coexistence was possible.
The Ottawa card remained in the deck, a silent warning, ready to be deployed again if the Field Marshal overstepped. In the following weeks, the 1st Canadian Army pressed across Europe, fighting through the mud and blood of the Scheldt estuary, clearing the vital route to Antwerp. They contributed to the final destruction of the Third Reich. Yet the incident in the rain-swept command tent remained a quiet but defining turning point.
It marked the moment the junior partner matured.
Historians often highlight grand strategies in famous battles, but the subtle duel between Montgomery and Crerar underscores the critical, sometimes volatile, politics of coalition warfare. It demonstrated that in a war fought for freedom, the right of a nation to command its own destiny was a prize worth risking everything for.
Montgomery attempted to assert the old imperial dominance.
Crerar, with a single sentence, proclaimed a new sovereign reality.
The British lion roared, but the Canadian maple leaf refused to bend.
Harry Crerar remained commander of the 1st Canadian Army until the final gun fell silent in Europe. Under his leadership, the army fought some of the war's most grueling and pivotal battles. They cleared the Scheldt estuary, opening vital supply lines to Antwerp. They breached the Siegfried Line in the Rhineland and, most notably, liberated the Netherlands, forging a lasting bond of friendship between the two nations.
The confrontation in the tactical caravan was never publicized. There were no headlines, no parliamentary inquiries.
It remained a tense, private moment shared only by a few men in a muddy French field.
Yet its significance echoes far beyond military history. It marked the end of an era. The days when a British field marshal could treat the Canadian Army as a colonial detachment were over.
Canada entered the First World War as a colony, automatically at war with Britain. It entered the Second World War as an independent nation, declaring war on its own terms a week after Britain. But it was in moments like the standoff between Crerar and Montgomery that independence was tested and proven. Crerar's refusal to be intimidated was not merely personal pride, it was national maturation. He affirmed that the Canadian Army answered not to the British Empire but to the Canadian people. The legacy of that moment is reflected in the autonomy of the modern Canadian Armed Forces. It demonstrates that alliances are partnerships of equals, not hierarchies of obedience. By threatening to consult Ottawa, Crerar reminded the world that his men were citizens of a sovereign nation, not expendable assets for foreign commanders. In the end, the 1st Canadian Army completed the war under its own flag, led by its own commanders, and accountable to its own government.
The paths did not diverge, they evolved.
And they evolved because one man, standing in the shadow of a military giant, had the courage to draw a line and declare, "This is where your authority ends and our country begins."